Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from around the world. Welcome to this special out of the season lecture of the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. My name is Simin Meidani, and I'm a member of the Program Committee of the Middle East Forum of Falmouth, or MEFF. For those who may be new to the forum, MEFF is a volunteer-run 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2006. Each season, we present a series of lectures featuring a broad range of perspective on complex and evolving issues facing the Middle East. Our programs are designed to encourage informed dialogue and thoughtful discussions. While our lectures are typically held during the summer season, the rapidly changing and consequential developments in Iran prompted us to organize this special program. We are very pleased to be able to offer a timely update on Iran today. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan national security think tank, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Prior to joining FDD, he worked on nonproliferation policy at an arms control think tank in Washington, D.C. He has authored and co-authored numerous articles and reports on Iran and regional security issues, and he regularly briefs journalists and public officials. He's also a member of the Anti-Defamation League's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Chicago. We are grateful he could join us today. Before I turn the podium to Behnam, I want to remind you to please submit your questions to the Q&A box rather than the chat. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Behnam Ben Taleblu for his lecture titled The Street versus the State in Iran, Implications and Opportunities for U.S. Policy. Behnam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maidani. It's always a pleasure to be with you and friends, old and new, at MEFF, albeit virtually this time. I had the pleasure about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, to be with you all, discussing a somewhat different angle of the challenges and opportunities that Iran policy presents for Washington. That was against the backdrop of the 2022-2023 Women, Life, Freedom movements, the nationwide protests in Iran that had kicked off then, as well as, of course, the whole deal or no deal drama that perturbed the Biden administration after October 7, given the different cycles of violence in the Middle East. And today, our conversation will get to bigger picture security issues, but we'll start local, we'll start internal, we'll start domestic, and we'll fan our way out. We'll begin with the latest from what I call a larger story. Some of you may have been seeing for many years now that I like to call Iran's national uprising. Then we'll connect that to potential U.S. responses, and then making sense of potential Iranian responses, because I think we're quite literally on the precipice of either a deal or a conflict with Iran via the U.S. In this critical part of the world. We know the Trump administration has been very focused on the Western Hemisphere. We know they've been very focused on great power competition and countering China. How they are actually able to kind of create a political solution, given the various military crises in the region, thus far remains to be seen. If you've looked at the national security strategy or the national defense strategy, the time and the effort to do the heavy lifting that some of the more political threats that we're hearing from the administration that are being made about Iran don't seem to have political congruence, but perhaps that may change in the coming weeks, months, or if not days, because this is a topic that is moving so fast, and where the balance between deals and conflict are changing equally as fast, with, again, massive stakes, not just for morals and politics, but also US strategy as well. And perhaps most importantly, to the first constituency that we're going to touch right now, which is the Iranian people. For some of you who have been looking at Iran for many years or many generations, or just even passively looking at Iran in the headlines, you know that protests are not an alien social phenomenon in Iran. They're actually quite organic, and almost as long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there have been protests against the Islamic Republic in various shapes and various forms. Why protests that began in December 2017, basically a decade ago, are drastically different than the iteration of nationwide protests that we saw in Iran, for example, in 1999 or in 2009, both of which were in Tehran, is because the population fundamentally began to engage in political protests without a political trigger. What does that mean? In 1999, you had protests in Tehran University and then across the city, particularly because there was the shutdown of a reformist newspaper and then the storming of Tehran University's campus. In 2009, you had a stolen election stolen away from a reformist presidential contender, and then a crackdown against protests who were turning out in favor of that candidate, and something that was popularly called the Green Movement or the Green Revolution. But in the ensuing decades between 99 and 2009 and 2009 and 2017, you had a whole host of interconnected battles, contests between the state and the street for power in Iran, labor movements, labor strikes, political organizations that have risen and fallen, as well as the overpromise and the underdelivery of the concept of reform within the Islamic Republic by Iranian political officials. That basically brought Iranian society, once it began to feel economic fissures, once it began to feel social fissures, once it began to feel environmental fissures, to be able to go out onto the street and rather than incrementally try to push the system along from within through electoral participation, to actually shun the ballot box, and then correlating with the decrease in electoral turnout, you had an increase in street protests. So Iranians from 2017 to present, whenever their life has been presented with economic shocks, social shocks, environmental shocks, what have you, have turned out to the streets to contest the state. And rather than try to rely on one element of the regime to help them, they are now trying to push past the regime altogether. It is certainly not couth to say in Washington, which is kind of done with the business of regime change in the Middle East. But since 2017, the one thing you can say that the majority of Iranians who have been turning out onto the street are actually desiring is fundamentally regime change in Tehran. In that country, you have a secular nationalist and young population, but you have an Islamist authoritarian and octogenarian political and military elite in that country. And these two things don't mix. You couldn't have fundamentally a greater contrast in Iran today, where you have a pro American and a pro Israeli, even population, and an anti American and an anti Israeli government. And this kind of difference has been hard for many in the West, in America, and elsewhere to sometimes begin to understand and comprehend. And it is through this lens of an increased willingness by Iranians to use every opportunity available to them to turn out to protest against their government that we get to the events of late December 2025. In late December, basically in the period between Christmas and New Year's, you had a visit to the US by Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, where President Trump basically gave the green light for another round of conflict with Iran should the regime rebuild its missile apparatus. Some of you may know the 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June 2025 was based on the nuclear threat. Well, now there was also the green light given to go after the missile threat. But amid that same press conference, merely hours into it, there were protests that began in Tehran's bazaar. And those protests quickly spiraled, despite being triggered by an economic crisis, quickly spiraled to be amplified by student protesters and labor unions and trade unions and a whole host of Iranians from very demographically diverse and very geographically diverse backgrounds, such that within less than a week, you had protests touching or acts of unrest and civil disobedience touching all of Iran's 31 different provinces. By our count now, 3.5 weeks into or past the protests, you have had protests touching anywhere from 200 to 400 different cities, towns, and villages. This is also a rural phenomenon as much as it is an urban phenomenon. And again, to reiterate, 100% of Iran's 31 different provinces have been protesting in these different in these different contests between the state and the street. Now, while the trigger for this was hyperinflation in the country, meaning the day that Iranians turned out to protest was the day that the rial, the unit of currency, reached 1.43 million to a single US dollar. Those larger political grievances that sustained, the Iranian population's grievance and disdain for the street were seen and felt in protest slogans. And also, you began to have protest slogans move away from simply shunning the regime and also begin to articulate that which they would want as an alternative for a different future, which was also an interesting phenomenon to see and hear, particularly with yours truly being a member of first generation American from the Iranian diaspora here. But as protests continued to swell and as bravery begot bravery on the streets of Iran, you had a critical inflection point coming up to January 8th, which was really the day that you had up to 1.5 million people in Tehran, potentially just under 1 million people in Mashhad, the country's second largest city, and actually the hometown of the current supreme leader. Bring everybody to an inflection point. And yes, there were calls for strikes among some Kurdish groups, labor strikes in the country's west for that day, for January 8th. Largely, the mass turnout was actually able to be begotten by the increasing linkage between external opposition, particularly late crown prince of the late Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, and internal protesters, such that the call to turn out en masse actually begot a mass wave of protests hitherto unseen since the Women Life Freedom movement of 2022, 2023, if not even before. And the reason this matters is the level of violence that the state used against the Women Life Freedom movement, to include a chemical campaign against Iranian schoolgirls throughout 2023 to get, the best and the brightest and the bravest of Iran's youth to get off the streets. Many assume the fact that the regime had, in the previous round of protests, used such a heavy hand that that would dampen the spirit or the ability of the Iranians to come out. But less than 2 years later, Iranians did come out and actually showed that despite the failure in the background of the Women Life Freedom movement of the Iranian diaspora and opposition groups abroad to be able to unify, despite that they were still willing to call at least the name of one of those individuals in external opposition and actually be able to ride that to, again, draw a nationalist contrast from the street to an Islamist authoritarian government that was the state in that country. And unfortunately, the state recognized this. And drawing on a playbook that they had unfortunately, again, mastered back in November 2019, where the regime not only tried to control the flow of information by throttling the internet, but shut down the internet altogether in a nationwide internet blackout. The goal of this internet blackout was to, one, disable or hinder communication between protesting Iranians, so impede their logistics. Two, to try to break that bond that they had sensed, both political and ideational, between external opposition and domestic protesters, but also logistical and organizational between external opposition and domestic protests. And cutting the internet would prohibit and prevent that flow of information. But then potentially, and perhaps most impactfully as we begin to discuss US policy, to be able to prevent the images, videos, text messages, and stories across Iranian social media and across just communications platforms from leaving the country to be seen as actually crossing President Trump's red line. And you may be asking yourself, President Trump's red line, what do you mean? Not once, not twice, but anywhere from 8 to 9 times, depending on how you count, starting in early January, President Trump actually touched this issue, making it an American national security issue. He didn't talk about the nuclear issue. He didn't talk about the missile issue like is in the news today. President Trump, riding on the experience that he had supporting, even if only rhetorically, Iranian protesters from term one, actually said that he would hold those engaging in the crackdown in the Islamic Republic responsible. There was many statements on radio, on television, to press, to reporters, in press releases, and even on social media by President Trump throughout the month of January. And the Islamic Republic did not want to be seen as crossing that red line of engaging in that mass crackdown to be able to give Donald Trump proof of having that red line crossed and then inviting military action onto them. And so the blackout happened nationally. And even between the first 48 to 36 hours of the blackout, depending on the report that you are looking at, Iran experienced the most significant crackdown from the state against the street, not just in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic, but given the very short time span, 2.5 days amid the 3.5 weeks of protest, in the first 2.5 days of the nationwide internet shutdown, which ultimately limped along for about 20 days of the 3.5 weeks of protest, you had anywhere from 12,000 to 16,500 to 20,000 to 30,000 to estimates now range between 36,500 to 43,000 Iranians killed in a span of 2 to 2.5 days. This is absolutely historic and record breaking for the government of the Islamic Republic in its 47-year history. But let me widen the aperture for you. This is absolutely historic and damning in the history of contemporary Iran. You have to go back 2 centuries to be able to have in recorded contemporary Iranian history that much of a crackdown from the state against society. The last thing that we can think of is the crackdown in the late 1790s, particularly of 2 cities that had betrayed this ruler, this warlord who was trying to rise to power in Iran. That is how much of a military solution, military option, and a brutal and grotesque one that the government chose to employ against the population, realizing that there is no social contract, realizing that there is no kind of lingering social legitimacy, realizing that there is no political way to pay off the protesters, as the regime talked about anywhere from a $7 to a $217 either cash handout or loan to certain families to help with some subsidies. There was no way to get the population off the streets. So the Islamic Republic unfortunately fell back to one thing that it had mastered before, which is killing Iranians under the cover of darkness. We mentioned 2019 November because that's the first time that you had this throttling and then later on full internet shutdown. Back then, from a period of 3 to 6 days under the cover of an internet blackout, you had 1,500 Iranians killed. Now, under the internet blackout, that lasted 20 days, but in the first 2 to 2.5 days, you have an estimated, again, 36,000 plus Iranians killed under the cover of darkness. So these numbers are damning and historic, not just because they grossly transgress President Trump's red line, but perhaps most importantly, because Iranian society has not experienced this level of mass casualty in such a short period of time before. Iran, unlike many of its neighbors, hasn't had civil war, hasn't had insurgency on a national scale. Its last major conventional conflict, minus the 12-day war with Israel, which was an air war, was the Iran-Iraq war. And while, yes, that was a damaging war for psyche and state and society, much of that war was fought on Iraqi territory. And yes, that was the 20th century's longest conventional war. But the sudden shock imposed on Iranian society absolutely cannot be understated, which is why that gets us now to US policy, because not once, not twice, but again, 8 or 9 times, depending on how you count throughout January, the US president, the commander in chief, the self styled negotiator in chief, the leader of the free world, if you will, rode on the experiences he had supporting Iranian protesters in term one to try to draw this red line, which thus far, as we record on February 1, 2026, remains unenforced. If you remember, Donald Trump back in term one had a through line through his Iran policy to draw a sharp contrast to his Democratic predecessor, Barack Obama. And the sharp contrast he sought to draw was to leave the nuclear deal that Obama agreed to in 2015. Donald Trump left that in 2018 for political and strategic reasons. But then also, in terms of the boom and bust cycle of Iranian protests, remember, we talked about 2017 being an important juncture. 2017 is when Donald Trump entered office, but 2017 is also when Iranian protests moved from seeking reform of the state to revolution and trying to push past the state. And it is against that backdrop that when Donald Trump, from December 2017 to January 2020, used maximum pressure against the government of the Islamic Republic, the first cow, sacred cow that he slaughtered was that the theory of if you have a state or a foreign state where you have the government hostile to America and the population pro-America, and the government and the state on fundamentally different sides of social issues and every other kind of issue, in the instance of you applying massive foreign pressure, you would ironically unite the state with the street. Donald Trump levied very tough sanctions called maximum pressure sanctions from 2017 to present. And not only did that not unite the state against the street and prevent this rally around the flag, but fundamentally the population, which was protesting in mass 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, in these different iterations of this larger movie that we can call Iran's national uprising, they actually never once uttered an anti-American slogan in all of their anti-regime protests from 2017 to 2020. And what the president did was to actually then break a second taboo or slaughter a second sacred cow when it came to Iran policy, which was to say that actually, contrary to what the Obama administration feared in 2009, which was that the foreign support, even if only rhetorical and political, and thus far only moral, would be some kind of a delegitimizing kiss of death and denude local protesters of agency and initiative. Actually, Trump showed that actually it was the reverse, that local protesters sought the spotlight. Local protesters sought the great power commendation and moral support and political coverage. And therefore, Donald Trump vociferously supported, rhetorically, if only, Iranian protests from 2017 to 2020, such that today, we're in February 2026, the most seen tweet and the most liked tweet history in Persian language on Persian Twitter remains Donald Trump's January 2020 tweet encouraging Iranian protesters earlier in his first term. So these were the trend lines. These were the things pushing President Trump to now in his second term in January 2026 draw these red lines, not about the nuclear issue, not about the missile issue, not about drones, not about terrorism, but about trying to support the Iranian people and trying to hold those who would engage in the crackdown against them accountable. But it seems like, and this is a fast moving story, and who knows what may come for the rest of the month of February. But throughout the month of January, there were ebbs and flows in the rhetoric. And thus far, again, at the time of this recording, that red line has not been enforced. Iranians continue to be executed. We continue to find more and more and more gruesome stories of how Iranians have been dying. There are stories of blood having to be power washed from the streets. There are stories of families having to pay for the bullets to actually get the bodies back of slain protesters. There's families of people being killed in bread lines, people being killed in cars, teenagers dying in between pylons under bridges, stories of security forces entering hospitals and shooting them up, killing protesters, and even reports allegedly where dying protesters on the street had their jugular veins sliced with box cutters. This is an entirely different story, a fundamentally different transgression of President Trump's red lines. And now that gets us into, well, now that these images and stories and texts and things that we can report based on sources in Iran from morgues, from morticians, from doctors, from lawyers, from friends, family members of slain protesters, or who had loved ones that were protesters that are now hospitalized, or who knew people who were, again, in protests. Based on all of those sources, you had that mass number that we talked about, and the US is figuring how best to militarily enforce this red line. And unfortunately, it seems like the Trump administration is putting out an option of a nuclear off-ramp. The challenge of a nuclear off-ramp or engaging in some kind of limited nuclear diplomacy or even maximalist nuclear diplomacy with the Islamic Republic at this stage is that a nuclear deal does not offset a massive humanitarian crisis that we just helped paint the picture for today. That was the story of Iran's national uprising. Now, as it gets to US policy, there is going to be a massive credibility issue. President Trump continues to talk about the arrival of the USS Abraham Lincoln and the carrier strike group that is now within striking distance of Iranian territory proper. We all know that there's already a whole constellation of bases and military facilities and installations throughout the Middle East, particularly in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, and in particular, the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, where the Gulf Cooperation Council hosts many airfields, bases, training centers, and whatnot. The US has brought in more air and missile defenses into the region. The US has brought ballistic missile defense-enabled Aegis destroyers into the region. The US has brought guided missile destroyers into the region. There are more frigates in the region. There's LCS vessels in the region. There are submarines in the region. And all of this hardening military posture is giving President Trump options. The million-dollar question is, towards what political option is militarily the use of force going to be applied towards? And given what we've seen with the US and the 12-day war, the short, sharp, and decisive use of force in what the US calls Operation Midnight Hammer, which was the strike against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, 2 of them being uranium enrichment facilities, Natanz and Fordo, and one of them being a major nuclear complex, Esfahan, where there was underground tunneling, the US then used Tomahawk cruise missiles and massive ordnance penetrators from a B-2 stealth bomber against these targets. Then, fast forward to just early January 2026, the operation to oust Maduro in Venezuela. All of this points to President Trump wanting to use short, sharp, and decisive military action. But again, on Iran, what does that look like? There's all these guessing games going on right now as to is the political strategy actually just strangulation? Remember, if this is going to be like Venezuela in Iran, and I'm not saying that it is, and I certainly hope that that is not the model that is applied here, but hypothetically, if that is what the White House and the administration is thinking, a military campaign follows the back end of economic and military containment, and that kind of strangulation could be the short-term effect of bringing more of these assets into theater to reduce the scope of options and room for maneuver available to the Islamic Republic, and to basically make them sweat and put the squeeze on them. So short term, what end is this feeding? This is feeding a containment end. Next option, if you ratchet up the ladder even further, what might the Trump administration be looking at? The Trump administration might be looking at deterrence by punishment, simply to be able to strike something in Iran, whether you can say that's substantive or symbolic, but to be able to strike something that says that they actually met their red line and to try to build up the credibility gap. If you strike something symbolic that has no salience or has no linkage with your larger strategy, in my eye, that actually diminishes your credibility rather than increases it. But nonetheless, this is an option on the table. So there's containment, there's deterrence by punishment. The next one, if you ratchet up the food chain, is decapitation. Could they do something like Venezuela militarily, where they try to take out the supreme leader or some of the political elite in Iran? I think this is an option that is very attractive to the Trump administration. I don't necessarily think that this is, again, the best option with respect to Iran, but I think that this is something the administration is interested in, basically musical chairs at the top. The X factor is the Iranian population did not turn out and lose this many lives from musical chairs at the top. One of the most consistent protest slogans we've heard, not since 2017, but since 2018, is neither reformist nor principlist. The jig is up. So fundamentally, the population, unlike Venezuela, is unlikely to settle for just musical chairs at the top. And this brings us to a potential other option, defanging. There are several schools of thought, both within America as well as within Israel, that see the weakness of the current regime in Iran today and the moral, quote unquote, righteousness of using force, given the crackdown from state against society today, to be able to recommence what was ended at the end of the 12-day war, which is to go after the regime in what we call a defanging mission, to go after the rest of the regime's strategic systems, to go after their long-range strike capability, to suppress their ability to engage in precision fire, whether that's drones, missiles, or whatnot, to go after their radars, to go after their bases, and to go after what's left of their nuclear capabilities. This option is called defanging. It's one step above decapitation. And then you also have fundamentally paving the pathway. And this can look very different, but it's paving the pathway to what end? It is, to be frank, paving the pathway for regime change. Had the Trump administration not waited, as it had, discussed all these different options and brought more assets into theater, there was, I think, a way to look at a potential military option against the Islamic Republic, not through the lens of short, sharp, and decisive, or as is popularly being talked about, a massive military operation, but rather a low intensity campaign, a low intensity campaign that could pave the pathway for protesters. Because hypothetically, if you strike a missile base in Yazd, and you strike a missile facility in Khorramabad, and you strike a missile production center in Shahrud, what net impact is that going to have on your average Iranian protester in Tehran or in Mashhad? It's going to have, in my view, in the short term, if it's not nested within a larger communication strategy and a larger political strategy, it's going to have next to no short-term impact on Iranian protests. And the goal here is, does President Trump want to drive more Iranian protests, or will he be content with leaving protests where they are? Or does he not mind that some military action could dampen Iranian protests? Lest we forget, political violence and the use of force is a form of political communication. But then when you try to also communicate a clear message on the back end of that, sometimes you can have mixed messages occur. We saw this during the 12-day war, where There were strikes on quote unquote elements of Iran's repression apparatus. There was a strike on Iranian state TV in Tehran. There was a strike on an IRGC facility in Tehran. There was even a strike on a famous prison in Iran, Evin prison. All of these have great symbolic value nested into a larger military campaign. But Israel during the 12-day war was messaging telling Iranians to come out into the streets to protest. Uh, Never mind the fact that Iranians don't have bunkers, don't have shelters like Israelis do, and also no one in the middle of a shooting war goes out into the street to protest. And also, perhaps more importantly, at the same exact time, America, which also later entered the 12-day war, was giving messages, and President Trump was quite emphatic in these messages to leave Tehran in its entirety. So mixed messaging can be quite dangerous and counterproductive, not just with respect to the potential for the loss of life, with whatever may come in terms of civilian casualties in a military operation, but in terms of how does Washington nest the use of force into a larger political strategy. The question is to what do they want to communicate, and what will the relationship with the potential targets that the administration goes after, as well as what actions they may or may not want protesters to do. This all remains to be seen and is one big question. So the how protests could drive regime change or bolster regime change is also an option. But like every single one of these options, comes with risks, come with challenges, comes with benefits. And this brings us to the Iranian people, which I'm not going to claim to speak on behalf of, but what you can hear from internally, what you can glean from social media is, despite this being a highly nationalistic population, and let me stress that again, a highly nationalistic population, everybody basically, as far as I can tell, has their eyes trained on what will Trump do next? Will Trump strike? Will he not strike? And given the massive loss of life, and given the fact that this is not a one-off in terms of protest, this is the continuation of the boom and bust cycle of protests that we have been talking about, that we have been seeing, where the best and the brightest go out onto the street unarmed and continue to get killed by the state's repression apparatus, which is a layered, unfortunately, coherent system of force that begins with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Underneath that has the ground forces, of which the all-volunteer paramilitary known as the Basij is a part of. The Basij is a check on Iranian civil society and protesters. Then, of course, you have the law enforcement forces, which are the national police. A subunit of that is the special forces, or the Yagana Vijay. Then beneath that, you have some of the semi-official / unofficial vigilante groups, the most popular one of which being Ansar Hezbollah. And then if this apparatus, this cocktail of armed to the teeth repression is not enough to frighten you, we have always heard in various iterations of street protests that since 2009 to present, but particularly since 2019, when there were flood protests in Iran and under the auspices of flood recovery and rebuilding areas that there had been, flood strikes, the government had brought in foreign Shia militias of Iran's quote unquote axis of resistance or transnational terror apparatus, particularly from Iraq as well as from Afghanistan, to be able to quote unquote build after the flood. But many protesters in areas that were stricken by floods in 2019 worried that this was basically a paramilitary check against them because they had been protesting due to the floods in this part of Iran. You always heard the allegation, you always heard the rumor since 2009 that sometimes you would hear security forces who spoke Arabic or who looked foreign. But fundamentally, you don't even have me saying that now. You don't have Iranian dissidents or diaspora saying that now. You don't even have Iranian opposition TV channels or whatnot saying that now. CNN reported earlier in January 2026 that there are at least 4 Iraqi Shia militias, 3 of which are designated U.S. foreign terrorist organizations with American blood on their hands that have crossed certain checkpoints from Iraq into Iran to basically be that latest point of the knife in this cocktail, in this apparatus of repression from the state against the street. So this architecture of military force is fundamentally why a nationalistic population with a long-standing unanswered political grievance is now ironically, fundamentally, largely, but not exclusively, looking to the West for some kind of military deliverance. And while that is as much emotional as it is political, and we can unpack that, and we wouldn't want to speak on behalf of every single Iranian because we can't do that here morally or politically, that is an objective metric of what we are seeing at different points in time, given, again, the sheer shock of what has happened and the sheer historicity of the crackdown. Now, regardless of which one of those military options America chooses on the back end of trying to level the playing field between the state and the street in Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran has options as well. And we'll run through a few of those options before turning it to Q&A. But those options are is what is being discussed a lot in the news these days, is what is probably catching your eyeballs when you're listening to coverage of Iran because you're hearing a lot of talk about a potential deal. Well, this is before the shooting starts. This is part and parcel of Iran's larger political strategy that we've seen in the region that I like to liken to a knife and a handshake. A knife because it wields the prospect of a military threat, but a handshake because there's always the opportunity that the regime is trying to tempt the other side into a larger, protracted diplomatic process that actually evens the playing field against them because the Islamic Republic is weaker today than ever before, especially against its foreign and conventionally superior adversaries. So this balance of a knife and a handshake is precisely what the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council in Iran, Larijani, does have on tap. It's also what the Foreign Minister, Arakchi, does have on tap. And it's also something that is fundamentally being I would say empowered is one word, or toyed with or tried by the region is another. And this is because of the really, you could say, 2 decades of bipartisan US foreign policy failure to be able to contest the Islamic Republic Iran meaningfully in the eyes of populations who abroad quite literally live on the fault lines of that threat. Many of these are America's more traditional Arab partners in the Persian Gulf, the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And these countries, remember, they are where Donald Trump first visited when he was president in 2017, and they all in 2017 encouraged his maximum pressure policy and posture on Iran. But Donald Trump also visited those countries in his second term as his first foreign trip in 2025, and actually they had changed almost 180 degrees. It's not that they had a friendlier view of Iran, but that their policy changed from contestation to accommodation and hedging because they had larger concerns about will America stay in the fight to counter and deter and roll back the threat from the Islamic Republic. And again, they were on the front lines of this Iranian diplomatic and military charm offensive of wielding a knife and a handshake at the same time. Such that today, one of the most perverse things that we're seeing is many elements of the US security architecture in the region have concerns about America's use of force in the region and are actually lobbying for some kind of diplomatic off ramp to avoid President Trump from having to enact or enforce that same red line that he had drawn just about a month ago when it came to standing with Iranian protesters and holding the regime accountable for the crackdown. If this Iranian game of a knife and a handshake does not deliver results, and again, I do not think there's a world in which there is a nuclear off ramp to a humanitarian crisis, but hypothetically, if America was going to make that Faustian bargain, if America was not going to make that Faustian bargain, what might the responses be from Iran if this moves into an all-out shooting war? I think there's three categories of responses from Iran. The third one gets into the things you're hearing and seeing from Iranian officials, including most recently today, the country's supreme leader, so-called supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, where he had re-upped a threat that we heard from political officials as well as military officials. But we'll get to that in just a second. Option number one for the regime, which I think is highly unlikely, but is an option, is the option of absorption. To absorb strikes, and kind of the thinking of Tom Schelling, where the absorption of pain is as impressive as the infliction of it. And to absorb strikes in a bid to not give America the kind of political incentive to go and escalate to the next round. That's one. Two is to achieve parity and engage in symbolic striking. One of the most interesting things about the Islamic Republic being conventionally weaker in military terms than many of its adversaries is that it still is punching back. It is consistently willing to engage in a game of incremental or graduated escalation. We saw this during Trump term one, Biden term one, as well as Trump term two, even against more conventionally superior adversaries, such that the largest ballistic missile barrage ever fired at US forces in recorded history was the Iranian missile barrages at the two US bases in Iraq in January 2020 after the US issued a drone strike, killing Iran's chief terrorist Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in January 2020. Similarly, when the US used force against Iran's nuclear program in June 2025, you had the Islamic Republic launch ballistic missiles at a geodesic radome facility at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. So achieving parity is one option in military terms, and hoping that Iran gets the last round, but America gets the more, potent target, and that gets into de-escalation. But option three is what Iranian officials have been saying, and I said that earlier. The country's supreme leader had just re-upped that option, which is massive military response, and in particular, a widening of the fronts or a regional war. The Islamic Republic is thinking that in a way to deny President Trump a short, sharp, and decisive military victory that does not lead to a political solution on American terms, the best way to avoid that would be to respond massively, unlike what they called was a limited or more restrained response in their missile exchanges with Israel in April 2024, October 2024, and June 2025. And in this respect, the fear here is that if Iran does respond massively, even in response to an American limited strike, what you might get is a successful Iranian response that draws blood. But the regime thinks that a response that draws blood might deter America. Whereas I think one of the clear through lines of Trump term one and Trump term two is if you do kill a US service person, that is actually an inducement and an opening to a greater use of force. So unintended escalation, misread signals here could get and beget a larger US-Iran war despite desire to not have one. And I think I will pause there and turn it over to, again, Dr. Meidani for questions. But that was the tour de force of what's happening, why it matters, and how we got here.
Thank you so much, Behnam. That was an excellent and very illuminating talk, and we truly appreciate the clarity and the depth that you brought to really a complex and very fast moving situation. So now let's get to the question and answer. And again, please do type your questions in the Q&A box so that I can easily track them. We have many, many questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can given the time that we have. So the first question is there a political and or activist structure within Iran to support the public uprising to move to a change in the regime?
So I'll be brief on this. I think any coherent political organization within the country has been snuffed out. That doesn't mean labor strikes. That doesn't mean popular protests. That doesn't mean any of the stuff that has constituted civil society pushing back on the state doesn't matter. It absolutely does matter. But the line in which it crosses into coherent political organization, particularly nonviolent, coherent political organization, is the line in which it gets snuffed out by a Islamist, autocratic, and armed to the teeth state, which is why, perhaps more than ever before, all eyes are on external opposition abroad. I believe at this point in time, whether you like it or not, and history could be a guide here, because even the less repressive previous regime in 1979, opposition had to come from abroad. So let alone in this case, opposition, I think, is going to have to come from abroad in a major way. So that which you see on the streets, that which you see with the protests, that which you see with the labor strikes, that which you see with the campus protests, that which you see with a very diverse demographic and geographic spread of protesters in Iran, yes, they all have the ability to, in a potentially nationalistic, freer future post-Islamic Republic of Iran, they can be whatever they want in terms of coherent political structure. But in terms of a bridging mechanism, the role they all play is the role of revolutionaries, not the role of coherent political organization. I believe the role of the only coherent political organization at this point in time can come from abroad, because the state simply will not allow them to rise up to pose that kind of a challenge. And unfortunately, when you look at the nature of the violent crackdown today, you can see that there is the bloody track record to support that assertion.
Thank you so much. Now, the next question is, if the US government took military action against Iran, would it be legal or illegal?
So I'm not either a lawyer on the domestic side or on the international law side, but certainly with respect to the responsibility to protect, which actually has UN Security Council support for it, if I'm not mistaken. and we've seen, I think, employed with respect in a botched way in other cases. I certainly think that would be a precedent to be able to look at. I also certainly think precedents when it comes to human rights violations and crackdown on your own people that the US employed in the 1990s against the Milosevic government in Serbia and the crackdown on Bosniaks there in the former Republic of Yugoslavia certainly do need to be looked at and do need to be marshaled by military lawyers and lawyers in the administration if they are going to be making the legal case for the use of force. But those are two precedents to look at. R2P, the responsibility to protect, how military force can be used to provide cover for or support for Iranian civilians and protesters, and to what the legal ramifications and justifications were from previous non-R2P humanitarian interventions like Serbia.
Thank you. Now, what are the implications if Trump does nothing after making so many threats, including moving, another aircraft carrier to the Middle East?
I would say there are gross implications. Gross implications, first and foremost, I'll end with where I think the heaviest are, which is the moral. But I'll begin with the political. Again, the through line for President Trump has been to do the opposite of his Democratic predecessor, whether that is Biden or whether that is Obama. And again, we mentioned President Trump trying to avoid looking like President Obama on Iran with the Green Movement in 2009. Obama not willing to talk about supporting Iranian protesters, and conversely, President Trump, therefore, being very willing to talk about supporting Iranian protesters, just for that sharp contrast. What the president would politically get himself into, and seems to be already facing, is an Obama Syria 2013 red line moment, where a red line is drawn, and then if not enforced, that has a major political effect on that president's legacy. And so President Trump, who has been keen to draw a sharp contrast to President Obama, would actually end up in the same category, despite having paid all the costs in Trump term one and in Trump term two of a drastically different approach to the Middle East and a drastically different specific approach to Iran. So that is the political challenge from the president. That bleeds into the strategic challenge for America and American credibility. Remember, less than 1 year after the Obama red line debacle in Syria in 2013, you had, again, Russia be willing to test the red lines with America and invade Crimea in 2014. Less than 1 year after the botched withdrawal of the US Embassy in Afghanistan and the end of America's longest war in its recorded history there in Afghanistan, and the shutdown of the embassy in Kabul and the flights out of Bagram Air Base and all the horrific humanitarian and messy images that came with that, you had less than 1 year after that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, particularly the east of Ukraine. So it is entirely possible that the image of irresolution, the signal of irresolution, projects weakness against America's major 21st century great power competitors. And given Russia's willingness to kind of test the air for where is America tough and where is America weak and be willing to push on that, that has a major in terms of deterring America's autocratic adversaries in the 21st century, which actually is a through line of Trump term one and Trump term two, both national security strategy and national defense strategy. That would be counterproductive, to put it mildly. From that flows the moral, which is President Trump didn't just say, go out and support and we're with you. He literally said, help is on the way. And the kind of belief in the belief that local Iranian protesters had in that statement, you had, unfortunately, so many harrowing images and videos of people knowing that they were going out to their deaths, but believing that to a certain degree behind them would be justice because America would intervene or Israel would intervene or someone else would intervene. But in particular, America's very clear statement that help was on the way. The moral deficit that provides, not just with President Trump, but also the United States of America, for future captive populations and for future pro-American populations under anti-American regimes would be devastating. And that's putting it mildly, not just because of how grotesque the military crackdown in Iran has been, but that it replicates the moral failure of encouraging protests but having no plan for real support that we saw with the US and Hungary in 1956, and that we saw with the US and Iraq after the first Persian Gulf War in 1991. And again, Iran is home to a very pro-American and very pro-Israel population. The strategic, moral, and political ramifications of losing that population in a place like the Middle East, where Iran, in terms of the Iranian people, have had a different view about 9/11, a different view about October 7th than even many of the societies where America has many pro-American friends, that cannot afford it to be understated.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, millions of Iranians have chanted for Reza Pahlavi. Do you think Reza Pahlavi has a chance to lead this uprising?
I think more so now than ever before, yes. And there is a through line between the regime's lack of popularity and doubling down of Islamism and the population's willingness to embrace an ideology that is 180 degrees opposite Islamism, which is nationalism. And there are many critiques one can have about the diaspora. Is it divided? Is it unified? Is it factional? Does it have too much trauma? Does it have too much unpacked baggage from adjudicating the legacy and the politics of the 1979 revolution and everything that came before that? Sure. But I don't think the Iranian people can afford to have the perfect be the enemy of the good. And one thing that you have to kind of give your, kudos to Reza Pahlavi is, for one, staying in the fight for 47 years, having a message that is inherently liberal, democratic, and more moderate than many other forces in the Iranian opposition who've come and went, waxed and waned with the politics in the past 47 years. So certainly, I think there is that coherence that is ideological that you see in Iran. You certainly see more and more reference to his name in slogans than ever before. And why Washington continues to have an allergy to this as an option, I'm not sure. This is not about your view about monarchy. This is not about your view as a republic. This is about how do you create a bridge to a post-Islamic Republic future such that the population can have the choice at the ballot box to pick whatever they want, constitutional monarchy or democratic republic or secular republic or whatever else you want to be able to call it. This is about how fast and how efficiently can you bridge to a post-Islamic Republic future. And in my view, I think you need somebody who has both a vision for the future and a credible track record for the past. And that's one of the things that the Pahlavi brand and the name gets you. Unfortunately, in the West, many have an allergy to it, but increasingly in Iran, many have gravitated towards it. And that's why Reza Pahlavi is in this very unique position, whereas contrary to many other foreign exiles or diaspora opposition groups, traditionally these diaspora opposition groups tend not to have grassroots or local support, but they tend to have major elite and Western support. The funny thing is, despite being the son of a monarch, he doesn't have, in my view, based on the politics of the moment, major elite Western political support. But he absolutely has grassroots, domestic, and local support, which again, that makes it more of a DC policy problem than an Iranian street problem. And we talk about 2017 being a critical juncture in the history of these protests. There is absolutely a straight line that we can draw from protests in the holy city of Mashhad in December 2017 when they chanted it in honor of his grandfather and they said, Reza Shah Ruhed Shad, or Reza Shah, may your soul be blessed. Straight line all the way from that to January 2026 in the town of Khomeini, which is the birthplace of the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, chants of long live the Shah, Javid Shah, in the birthplace of Ayatollah Khomeini. And if the West or Washington misses that intellectual evolution among Iranian protesters, well, again, that too is a moral and political and strategic own goal.
Thank you. Now, is there any component of the military in Iran that might at some point side with the popular uprising?
That really is the $1 million question, whether you believe in intervention or not, whether you believe in popular protest or not. We are coming up on an anniversary date right now. I mean, the date that we are recording this, February 1, 1979, is nestled between January 16, 1979, when the Shah left Iran, and February 11, 1979, when the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution was declared victorious. On February 1 is when Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile from France to Iran. In that 10 days is when there was massive pressure on the interim government in Iran, and in particular on the military forces, not just the elites, but the body, the conscripts, to get them to defect en masse. Some did, some didn't. But when you got to February 11th, which is called Victory Day because that's the day the late Shah's army declared neutrality, that should help focus the mind right now that on if this regime has an apparatus of repression, and their main tool is to not politically or economically meaningfully buy off and meet the protesters where they are. Their main tool is oppression. Well, then you have to at least be able to have a political strategy to get the guns offside or at least on your side. And that's where I think there needs to be more done from Washington. There needs to be a defector strategy. I don't know why every major intelligence organization in the world doesn't have, or if it does have, we don't know to what degree it's working, a strategy to foster defections and have fragmentations within Iran's security elite. Yes, whenever there is more foreign pressure, the elites, whether they're political, economic, or military, do become more cohesive. But under sustained pressure is when these guys tend to crack because they're fighting over a diminishing piece of the pie, and you get more intra competition than inter competition. All of this, really raises the alarm bell, both for Western policymakers and Iranian opposition and dissidents and activists to have a strategy to help foster defections, because that is going to be key to actually creating a post-Islamic Republic Iran.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, are there forces in the Middle East that are pressuring the US not to act in Iran?
There are several constituencies of actually pro-American actors that have questions about American military staying power in the region, that have fears of the Islamic Republic's ability to threaten them and lash out into the region, and there are some may even somewhat conspiratorially say may not have the same goal of a potentially free, liberal, and democratic Iran, given the way that they rule their own countries and societies at home. At the moment, within the region being defined as the Middle East, you have some countries within the Gulf Cooperation Council. Previously, you had Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Qatar, per New York Times and Washington Post reporting, if I'm not mistaken, trying to lobby the Trump administration to not to strike or at least to bring more assets into region. Saudi Arabia now seems to be on the side of, well, you need to bring more assets into the region, and it would be a mistake not to strike. But I think many of those other countries are still interested in retaining their mediator role between the Islamic Republic and America. Similarly, there's a diplomatic effort underway right now between between Turkey, which is a NATO member in the Middle East and the only NATO member in the Middle East, as well as Egypt, which is a major American recipient of aid, as well as Qatar, which is a major US non-NATO ally that does host major US military installations, to try to foster some kind of a meeting this week in Turkey between Iranian officials, as well as between US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. So all these countries, whether due to longer term strategic and political fears of Iran coming in from the cold and having their lunch, but much more acutely of Iran responding to a US strike and the havoc that would come from a US strike, and potentially the cost of an Iranian response on their territory, as well as what role the US would play in turning on and turning off the cycle of violence there, are making, in my view, with immense respect and deference, are making, in my view, the analytical assumption, which I believe is a flawed assumption, that stasis with the Islamic Republic equals stability. If stasis with the Islamic Republic equaled stability, America would not have created the force that became CENTCOM in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War, and many of our friends in the GCC countries would not have built bases to house American military facilities and be major purchasers of American and Western arms had they not faced this major threat from the northern part and the eastern part of the Persian Gulf. So in my view, stasis with the Islamic Republic does not equal stability, but those state actors that are trying to foster mediation actually analytically do believe that, and I believe it's a flawed assumption.
Thank you. And now, unfortunately, we need to stop this part because we're running out of time. Behnam, thank you again for a terrific and thought-provoking presentation. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for your excellent questions. MEFF is entirely volunteer-run organization, and your support helps us continue to offer these programs free to the public. Please visit www.MEFF.world to register for the next presentation and also to view recordings of our previous presentation, including this one, and support the forum if you are able to. Thank you again for being with us, and wherever you're joining us from, have a wonderful rest of your day. Good night.
Thank you.